because that was
I
strange.
can't talk about that on television.
Well, you can maybe work around it.
No, we can't. Nothing.
I see.
We won't talk about it.
Okay.
Mel Brooks is one of the greatest comedy directors who ever lived. He made legendary movies like Blazing Saddles and Young Frankenstein that are still hilarious today. But here's something most people don't know about him. He has an incredible memory for anyone who ever crossed him. We're not talking about holding grudges over small stuff. We're talking about actors who walked onto his movie sets thinking they knew better than the guy who created some of the funniest films in history. When that happened, Brooks didn't yell or throw tantrums. He just quietly made sure they never worked for him again. Today, we're going to tell you about 5 talented actors who made that fatal mistake. These weren't nobodies. They were big names with serious skills. But they all broke the one rule that mattered most in Mel Brooks's world. And once you broke that rule, there was no coming back. Before we dive into these stories, you need to understand how Mel Brooks operated as a director. This wasn't some laid-back guy who just let actors do whatever they wanted. Brooks ran his movie sets like a master conductor leading an orchestra. Every joke, every line, every pratfall had to happen at exactly the right moment, or the whole thing would fall apart. He'd been doing this since the 1960s, working with comedy legends on shows like Your Show of Shows, and by the time he was making his biggest hits, he knew exactly what worked and what didn't. The thing is, Brooks was actually pretty easy to work with if you understood one simple concept. You were there to serve the comedy, not the other way around. Your job wasn't to show off how talented you were or prove how smart you could be. Your job was to make the audience laugh, even if it meant looking ridiculous in the process. Some actors got this immediately and became part of his regular crew. Others thought they knew better, and that's where our story really begins. Let's start with Frank Langella, who you might know from movies like Frost Nixon or the recent White Lotus. Back in the 1990s, Langella was considered one of the most serious dramatic actors around, the kind of guy who could make Shakespeare sound like everyday conversation. So, when Mel Brooks was making Dracula, Dead and Loving It, Langella seemed like the perfect choice. He'd already played Dracula on Broadway and been absolutely incredible at it. Tall, mysterious, with this deep, commanding voice, he was basically Dracula come to life. The problem was, Brooks wasn't trying to make a serious vampire movie. He wanted to take all that gothic drama and turn it completely ridiculous. Picture Dracula getting his cape stuck in a revolving door, or accidentally stabbing himself with his own cape while trying to look menacing. That's the kind of movie Brooks was making. But Langella just couldn't let go of being dignified. Every time Brooks would give him a note about playing something for laughs, Langella would nod politely and then go right back to performing like he was in a serious drama. It was like watching someone try to perform Hamlet at a comedy club. The moment that ended, everything happened during a script reading. Brooks had written this scene where Dracula tries to make a dramatic exit, but gets his cape caught in a revolving door. It's exactly the kind of visual gag that Brooks was famous for, taking something that should be scary and making it completely absurd. When they got to that part in the script, Langella read it like it was a tragic death scene. He put so much serious emotion into it that the entire room went dead silent. Afterward, Brooks tried to explain what he wanted, but Langella just looked at him and asked, "Do you want me to mock the text?" That question told Brooks everything he needed to know. Langella wasn't protecting the character. He was protecting his own dignity as an actor. Within a week, Langella was quietly replaced by Leslie Nielsen, the guy from Airplane, and The Naked Gun. Nielsen understood exactly what Brooks wanted, someone who could play everything completely straight while the world fell apart around them. That's what made it funny. Langella never spoke publicly about getting fired, and Brooks never badmouthed him. But whenever anyone asked Brooks about the movie, he'd praise Nielsen and never mention Langella's name at all. This next story is probably the most heartbreaking because it wasn't about some random actor Brooks barely knew. Gene Wilder was Brooks's best friend and creative partner. If you've seen Young Frankenstein or Blazing Saddles, you've seen their magic together. Wilder wasn't just an actor in Brooks's movies, he was like a brother to him. They could finish each other's jokes and knew exactly how to make each other laugh. For years, they were an unstoppable team, but sometimes the people closest to you are the ones who can hurt you the most. After Young Frankenstein became a massive hit, Wilder started getting ideas about directing his own movies. He wrote a script called The Adventure of Sherlock Holmes' Smarter Brother and asked Brooks to produce it. This should have been an easy yes. Your best friend and collaborator wants your help with his dream project. But Brooks said no. He didn't think Wilder was ready to direct yet, and he was probably trying to protect his friend from making a career mistake. But Wilder didn't see it that way. He saw it as betrayal. What happened next was one of those quiet Hollywood tragedies that nobody really talks about. Wilder went ahead and made his movie without Brooks's help. It had some of the same actors from their previous films, like Marty Feldman and Madeline Kahn, but it just wasn't the same. The timing was off, the magic was missing. Meanwhile, Brooks and Wilder stopped talking entirely. Not in some dramatic public way, they just drifted apart like friends sometimes do after a big fight. Years went by without them speaking to each other. Brooks later told someone that it felt like watching his brother pack up and leave home, except he took all their best jokes with him. Eventually, they did reconcile and became friends again, but they never worked together after Young Frankenstein. That creative partnership that had produced some of the greatest comedies ever made was over forever. Sometimes Brooks would talk about how Wilder was the only actor he ever completely trusted with his half-finished ideas. He could show Gene a scene that wasn't quite working, and Gene would instinctively know how to fix it. After their falling out, that trust never came back. Here's where the story gets really interesting. Chevy Chase never actually worked with Mel Brooks, and that's exactly the point. During the 1980s and 90s, Chase was one of the biggest comedy stars in the world. He was the breakout star of the original Saturday Night Live, and movies like Caddyshack and National Lampoon's Vacation had made him a household name. Studios kept pushing Brooks to cast him because Chase was basically a guaranteed box office draw. But every single time someone suggested Chevy Chase for a Brooks movie, Brooks found a way to say no. The reason had nothing to do with Chase's comedy skills and everything to do with his personality. Brooks had this incredible ability to sense how people would fit into the delicate ecosystem of a movie set. With Chase, all his instincts were screaming warning signs. Brooks had watched Chase on TV, heard stories from other people in the business, and could tell that Chase was the kind of performer who had to be the smartest person in every room. That's not what Brooks wanted. He wanted actors who could land a punchline and then step back to let someone else get the next laugh. The closest Chase ever came to working with Brooks was during the casting for Spaceballs, Brooks's Star Wars parody. Someone suggested Chase for the villain, Dark Helmet, and on paper, it made perfect sense. Chase had the right voice, the right look, and could definitely deliver the kind of pompous dialogue the character needed. But Brooks barely considered it. He wanted Rick Moranis instead, a guy who most people knew from SCTV and Ghostbusters. Why? Because Moranis understood something Chase didn't: how to disappear into a character completely. Moranis could play Dark Helmet as if he genuinely believed he was the most terrifying villain in the galaxy, even while tripping over his own cape. Chase, Brooks suspected, would always be a little too cool for the material, like he was doing everyone a favor by showing up. There was apparently one brief meeting between Brooks and Chase that was arranged by their agents. It didn't go well. Chase showed up late, spent most of the time explaining what was wrong with modern comedy, and basically treated Brooks like he was lucky to be in the same room. Brooks listened politely and knew immediately they'd never work together. Harvey Korman is a name you might not recognize, but you've definitely seen his work. He was one of the main players on the Burnett show for years, and had this incredible ability to play pompous, self-important characters that were absolutely hilarious. Brooks cast him in several movies, including Blazing Saddles, where he played the main villain. Korman was genuinely brilliant at what he did. He could deliver a ridiculous monologue with perfect timing and then let his face collapse into pure comedy gold. So what went wrong? The problem was that Korman came from television, where shows were built around the performers and everyone was expected to contribute ideas and improvise. That's not how Brooks worked. Brooks was like a symphony conductor who had every note planned out in advance. When actors started changing things or adding their own bits, it threw off the entire rhythm he was trying to create. The breaking point came during a movie called High Anxiety, which was Brooks's parody of Alfred Hitchcock films. Korman was playing this sinister psychiatrist, and instead of just doing what was written, he kept wanting to add new character traits and rewrite his dialogue. What should have been a smooth production turned into what crew members later described as passive warfare. There was no yelling or dramatic confrontations, but every single scene became a negotiation. Korman would question every direction, pause between takes to discuss his character's motivation, and generally slow down a director who needed to keep things moving fast to maintain the comedy's energy. Brooks, who was usually quick to joke around with his actors, started getting quieter and more distant. By the end of filming, they were barely speaking directly to each other. Brooks would give Korman notes through his assistant director instead of talking to him face to face. The movie still turned out fine. Korman was too professional to let personal tension affect his performance, but Brooks never forgot how exhausting it had been. After High Anxiety, Korman's name just stopped appearing in Brooks's movies. There was no big blow-up or public statement, just a quiet understanding that they'd gone as far as they could together. Brooks summed it up perfectly years later. Some actors bring joy to a set, while others bring brilliance but always with a fight attached. Jerry Lewis was already a legend by the time this story takes place. If you don't know who he is, think of him as the Jim Carrey of the 1950s and 60s. Incredibly physical, over-the-top comedy that either made you laugh until you cried or drove you absolutely crazy. Lewis had been a massive star, both as part of a comedy duo with Dean Martin and later on his own in movies like The Nutty Professor. In the 1980s, studios started pushing for Lewis and Brooks to work together, thinking it would be comedy gold. Two masters of their craft collaborating on something amazing. The reality was very different. Brooks and Lewis were actually too similar to work together. They were both guys who liked to control every aspect of their projects, who had very specific ideas about how comedy should work and who weren't great at compromising. When they finally met for dinner to discuss a possible collaboration, it was a disaster from the start. Lewis showed up almost an hour late, immediately launched into a lecture about the state of American comedy, and barely acknowledged that Brooks was even at the table. Brooks sat there politely listening to Lewis explain his theories about entertainment for what felt like forever. When Lewis finally paused to ask Brooks about his own approach to comedy, Brooks gave him a simple answer. "I try to make people laugh without," explaining to them why it's funny. It was a gentle way of pointing out that Lewis had just spent an hour doing exactly that, explaining comedy instead of just being funny. But Lewis completely missed the hint and launched into another long explanation of his methods. Brooks realized that working with Lewis would be impossible, not because Lewis wasn't talented, but because Lewis needed to be the center of everything. Brooks built his movies around ensembles where everyone contributed to the larger goal of making people laugh. Lewis built his projects around Lewis. After that dinner, Brooks never seriously considered working with him again. As he put it later, some people think they're the center of the universe, and they can't function in anyone else's universe, even temporarily. The meeting ended with polite handshakes and promises to stay in touch, but both men knew nothing would come of it. So what do all these stories tell us about Mel Brooks and how he worked? The pattern becomes pretty clear when you look at them all together. Every single one of these actors had serious talent. That was never the issue. Frank Langella was a great dramatic actor. Gene Wilder was a comedy genius. Chevy Chase was a major star. Harvey Korman was incredibly skilled, and Jerry Lewis was a legend. But they all broke the same unwritten rule that governed Brooks's sets. The comedy comes first, your ego comes second. Langella couldn't stop being dignified long enough to look ridiculous. Wilder couldn't trust his mentor's judgment about his career. Chase couldn't stop being the coolest guy in the room. Korman couldn't stop trying to perfect things that were already working. Lewis couldn't imagine being part of something he didn't control. For Brooks, making movies was like conducting an orchestra. Every musician had to play their part perfectly, but more importantly, they had to trust that the conductor knew what the final symphony should sound like. When that trust broke down, the music stopped, and the musician got quietly replaced. The most remarkable thing about all these stories is how Brooks handled them. He never publicly embarrassed any of these actors or told nasty stories about them in interviews. He just quietly closed the door and moved on. That's probably why most people don't know these stories. Brooks wasn't interested in burning bridges or making enemies. He was interested in making people laugh, and when working with certain actors made that harder instead of easier, he found other actors to work with. In Hollywood, where grudges and feuds are practically an art form, Brooks was unusually classy about the whole thing. But make no mistake, once you were out of his world, you stayed out. There were no second chances, no redemption arcs, no dramatic reconciliations. The door closed quietly, but it closed forever. Maybe that's the real lesson here. Talent will get you in the room, but how you treat the people around you determines whether you get to stay. In Mel Brooks's universe, getting cast was never the reward. Staying cast was the real achievement, and these 5 actors learned that lesson too late. Sometimes the most dangerous enemies aren't the ones who fight you openly. They're the ones who simply forget you exist.